How's it going, folks? It's Juno here. I've been having an idea recently. So I did the video on information degradation as a driver for civilization decline. Maybe even civilization collapse, probably would have been a better title. But it's got me thinking about how information exists and what are its properties. And something that entered my mind was the idea that information maybe doesn't exist as static data, but maybe there's something dynamic about the data. And what do I mean by that? Well, in spatial reality, right? In a spatial dimension, we can track the progression of a point between different coordinates. And the point itself only exists in one spatial coordinate, but an object can traverse different coordinates as a continuous thing, right? It has some permanence to it. It still contains the properties of the thing inherent in itself, regardless of which position it occupies. But obviously, as it's traversing, there is some other metric which is also being accumulated, which we would sometimes, I suppose, look at as being the temporal dimension. And you could look at that metric in multiple ways, right? You could have additional temporal dimensions. You could have, like, not just one time, so 1 second plus 1 second, and that follows on. You could have incremental time, or even like a disjointed time, or multiple times running at once. Okay? So maybe you could have, just like you can have like an x-axis and a y-axis, you can have physically something that moves across the x-axis can also move across the y-axis as well, and that's just looking in 2 dimensions. But if you applied that to time, so you could have time that moves in 1 dimension across the time x-axis, but that's not to say that then it would be impossible for time to move across the y-axis as well, maybe at the same time, maybe separately. But nevertheless, theoretically, it's entirely possible, right? If we boil these concepts down to their base principles. And that makes me think quite interestingly about things that exist in time. And one of those would be information, right? So data exists in time. And if these qualities are shared between objects and data, all right, so an object exists in a spatial dimension and also has temporal qualities to it. If thoughts, or if information, if the quality of something also exists in some way, spatially and temporally, then does it share any other defining characteristics with objects as we know them? And that made me think about evolution. All right, I talk about evolution a lot. I think it's a driving force, but not only that, I think it's a signifier of a greater system. So I think the fact that we recognize evolution in biology, we're just scratching the surface on uncovering a greater system of calculation that exists as a base parameter, but then emerges in these different complex environments and continues to emerge and keeps re-emerging in different areas. Which I think if you look, you can see evolution in a lot of different places. It's just under different names, but it's the same emergent system that keeps happening. And so I wonder, does data evolve, right? Does data evolve? Well, what's one of the fundamental elements of evolution? You'd argue mutation is a very strong contender for that description. And so let's see, can we apply mutation to information, to data? And I would argue the kids' game, Chinese Whispers, is a really good example of this, where a data set is driven out initially, and then as the data set passes through different data handlers, the data itself is evolving. And what's interesting is the message at the end and the message at the beginning may functionally have many similar properties, but their appearance may be quite different. Moreover, you see a kind of maladaptive evolution in Chinese whispers, where in some games, what goes in is highly functional and to the purpose, and then what comes out is unusable, is data void of context or contingency. It lacks what's the word I'm thinking of? It doesn't follow one to the next. So the words seem to lose relation with one another, and it loses its function because of that. Now, we see that obviously in evolution as well, biologically speaking, in certain environments, when there's like a glut of resources, for example, will drive up non-useful or maladaptive mutations. So in the same way, when we look at Chinese whispers, maladaptive mutations to the message also incrementally creep in as there are different iterations of information as it passes between one person to the next. So if that's just one offhand reference of informational mutation or data mutation, how can we look at perhaps other examples or evidence of it existing in other systems? Because information or data is a key and fundamental property of matter, right? When we speak about things like cosmological events, black holes and the like, or virtual particles, we often speak about information, the information that's being, created or destroyed or held, or whatever, right? If we're speaking in these ways, whether or not they're actually happening, but as long as we're describing them in such ways, can we also describe information itself, data itself, as having contingent properties that allow it to exist, have some object permanence, even if its form changes? And maybe this is quite a deep philosophical question, looking at, Trigger's broom. I think it was Trigger's broom, or it's a ship of some kind. I can't remember the exact example, but basically it's a ship leaves port, it's made in one way, and then as it sails and travels and ages, different parts of the ship require replacement, and by the end of its life, it's had almost everything replaced, and it's asked, is that ship still the same ship that it was originally? Can you still consider it the same thing? And I wonder if you can view data in the same way, all right? Does any specific change essentially mean that the data is now different? It's not the same as it was. It's not the same thing as being a parcel of data. As a human being who cycles through so many divisions and multiplications of their cells, where the cellular mass is turned over to such an extent that only a fraction still exists of the original, and yet we still can consider that to be one contingent being. All right, the being still has the same identity, even though so many of its parts have changed. And can we look at data in the same way? Right? Now, I suppose if in the example of Chinese whispers, right, the data has an identity. And that identity is, it's the message. As long as the message is still held in the first person's mind of what they originally said, they have a notion, they have an idea of the identity of the data. And then when it comes out at the end, is that essentially still the same data? Because it is still quote unquote the message, right? As passed from one to another, it was always the message. But the message itself has changed. So maybe its components, like the components of data, can mutate and evolve. But does that necessarily mean that it is now a different piece of data, or is it still the same data? In the same way, like if you can mark it temporally or spatially, can you say that at this point it was the same piece of data as it was later down the line, even though there were things internally within it that changed? They were still the same data set or the same piece of data. I'm not sure I have answers to that. But I still think, nevertheless, it's a very interesting question to ask. And if it can change, all right, if we use it from the functional element, as I said, if information can become maladaptive, which is what I've talked about a little bit in my other videos in terms of how closely or accurately information needs to be relayed for the success of a group, and then as group success is driven up, it can tolerate more and more noise against the signal. So the signal, the quality information, the close to accurate to reality information can actually decrease as a proportion, while the noise, so the inaccurate information or the misinformation, anything that's not accurate, so therefore not a reflection of reality, is increasing. But the success of the group means that it has higher tolerance for misinformation. But as the trend ascends, that may ultimately lead to some sort of critical mass where it becomes unsustainable and irreversible, and then it causes civilizational collapse. But if we're not talking on those scales, but simply on the scales of individuals, is there some example where you can say a similar thing, like we're born into the world with no preconceived notions, but some instinct? Arguable, I know, but bear with me. And then as we live, we experience things, and perhaps in our earlier stages we take things at face value, but then as we age and experience more, we begin to assign non-obvious or non-apparent qualities to certain things from our experience. So we will learn that there are some things that aren't apparent or obvious, and then we sort of subtitle or contextualize the new information we have in the bedding of the old information that's not apparent in that moment, but we understand that to be the context. Maybe there comes a point then where quite far down the line we produce more context than genuine new information, and so in a struggle to fit that all together and to give everything its proper place in our worldview, in our understanding of reality, it then is compromised to the point where it no longer holds true to reality, but it only holds true to the narrative. And that's where the dysfunction reaches a critical point, that the information no longer has functional use because it no longer tells us about the world. It no longer provides us with useful information. The only thing it is a reflection of ourselves. It's a reflection of what we want to hear, and therefore it's an incarnation of our psyche, of our insecurity. We want to hear it, this comforting, therefore that's what we end up hearing. And because it's driven by what we want rather than what is real, it no longer serves the purpose of actually aiding us in negotiating the real. And that's the root of success, right? That's the root of affecting something, taking action, having behaviors that are effective, is have them engage with reality in the most, to the largest proportion possible, and then you will see the most outcome. But if you cannot engage with reality, then you can perceive outcome, but nothing will really happen. Like, you can believe you're eating a meal, but if it's an imaginary one, you will still starve to death. And so, yeah, I think that's some interesting thoughts to think about. Just mull over them for a bit, and see if you can justify the evolutionary purpose of that mutation, that informational mutation, that data mutation. Is it something that's been programmed into us, learned into us, that we have as an adaptive quality, or is it actually just as harmful as a malignant mutation? Just as in Chinese whispers, when you pass the message on and it becomes non-functional, similarly, society can, a societal system, a civilization, cooperational group can accommodate for more and more lag, more and more errors, less and less efficiency in negotiating reality by alienating itself from reality more and more. Like, as it's able to move away, and only the bits that matter, like food production, retain their accuracy. The other parts are able to then move away from reality in incremental steps, and it's still maintainable, right? People can still get fed, the civilization can still continue. So I suppose the bit you have to worry about is, while overall society might lose integrity from a reality accuracy standpoint, as long as the parts that are still producing the necessary bits are continuing, you can have quite a heavy burden. Right? You can have a lot of society that's far away from reality and inaccurate in its constituents, but as long as that one bit that's functioning still keeps people ticking over, you can continue on. So it gains a carrying capacity, if you like. And there may even be some residual from that. So as more and more sort of wild mutations mentally or informationally or physically get incorporated, occasionally one will spit out something that advances the necessary parts of society, civilization, to maintain itself. And because of that, you're then able to perpetuate further. But it doesn't usually result in a sustainable thing. It just happens that occasionally something comes out that keeps it going a bit longer. And if you look back to the Chinese Whispers example, which I mean is a classic example of evolution, right, of mutations. It is used usually to be an analogy, to give a demonstration, but it's not often used to express that data itself, information itself mutates, right? But nevertheless, I think it could be used for that, and I think it's very interesting to at least attempt to reconcile these viewpoints, these perspectives, because maybe there is something to be gained by doing so. And interestingly, if you have so we're looking back at how the carrying load can increase even while some elements of the organism are actually decreasing in their efficiency. All right, so you're increasing mutational load, but you're also increasing carrying capacity at the same time, so you're able to accumulate it. And that's kind of like interventional medicine, okay, or health and fitness, like knowledge about health and fitness. So in past iterations of human, there would have been such a high failure rate that small imperfections would often lead to very serious disadvantages. However, as we've been able to intervene in small ways incrementally over time, we now have a lot of knowledge about, vitamins, minerals, the requirements of the body, how to counteract certain opportunistic pathogens that may otherwise take advantage of a less than ideal homeostatic environment. And we're able to accommodate for things like pollution and remove like heavy metals from the environment. Things that maybe our ancestors would have occasionally been exposed to and therefore would have required a biology that could manage it. But because we can now have such a high carrying capacity for the population, that's going to inevitably increase mutational load. Therefore, we need to counteract it just to maintain a little bit of growth or our current state. And so, saying now that we have like the most knowledge about healthy living and the most people practicing healthy living, so regular exercise and a healthy diet and things like avoiding junk food, staying away from pollution, all these kind of behaviors, these are only making up for what we may have lost biologically, okay, because we now have additional mutation. And in the same way, looking at information in that way, looking at data in that way, as you increase the gross pool of data, you may find that there'll be some positive adaptations to the data as it evolves, but there'll be far more maladaptive mutations in the data. And then what you do is you begin to manage the data differently. So you can accommodate for more maladaptation in the data by having different operational procedures when utilizing the data itself. So you're able to like exclude, you're able to do more complex search functions, you're able to prioritize information. So like when you're dealing with incomplete sets or imperfect sets, you then increase your administrative capability to then sort and filter and manage the information better. All right, so you're sort of counteracting the problem as it's developing, but you're not preventing it. This is the issue. You're not actually preventing the problem. You're just managing the condition until it becomes terminal. And that is true in a biological sense, but it's even true in an information sense, in a data sense, okay? And this is probably one of the more concerning things about what the situation is today is, like I said before, I think somebody said it's probably a factor of 1,000 to 1 in terms of misinformation to information, like to genuine factual information, correct stuff. But what if that's not a steady state? What if previously it was much lower and we can chart a course into the future and it shows actually there's a good chance it's going to be much higher? Will there come a point where we can no longer manage it, right? There are no more techniques or technologies to be discovered that can avoid the inevitable. Because it's a very interesting discussion to have. What are the realistic limits of technology? And it's hard to say, but there must exist some limit to technology. All right? Technology is not infinitely powerful because we're not in a universe of infinite opportunity. Our universe is guided by certain principles. It is restricted by certain laws. Therefore, it is guaranteed that a technology can only do what is possible and not what is impossible. So we already understand through formal logic, technology does not have infinite power. It will be limited in some ways. And what we need to do on some level is determine a way of setting our expectations. You know, what is feasible for us to understand about the future in terms of what technology could potentially do. It's great to plan and forecast in that way as well, because then it gives us an idea, a roadmap of, well, if we know what technology itself is capable of, maybe we don't have to go through an iterative process to get there. Maybe we can, skip a few steps, understanding what the future holds. And that's always a very interesting strategy, right? Like, I've made a video about this before, but you can take, say, a rifle, and once you strip it down to its basic components, then you begin to look at, all right, can we change the materials? Can we change the tolerances? How do we engineer it exactly for its specification and not extra or less? What does I'm still in the process of doing an engineering video because I really want to get to the heart of what engineering really is, not from like a science or construction or architectural perspective, but really from a core, almost philosophical perspective of what is it to be an engineer, what is it to do engineering. But in some ways, I think it's important at least to state now that objects have things and objects are things, and they're not the same thing. All right, that famous line in Pirates of the Caribbean where Johnny Depp is like, a ship isn't a sail or a rudder or the deck. That's what a ship has. What a ship is something else. And I think that's important to remember. Again, the gun example. If I have a gun, ultimately, the functioning part of a gun that makes it a gun is the combustion chamber in the barrel, right? It's like a cannon, really. A gun can have a stock or a butt and a trigger and a barrel guard, and it can have an upper receiver, a low receiver. It can have all these components, right? It can have iron sights. It can have all these things. It can have a magazine. But what a gun is, it isn't all these things. It's the core element of what provides its function. And if you were to decide on a function to meet an objective, then engineering really begins with confirming what the objective is and finding the best solution to meet that objective before you even discuss the function. All right? So if you were looking at the best weapon, you may pick a gun because that's what we currently have. That's the conventional thinking. But if you understand the true objective of the weapon, right, you may begin to look at other things. Okay, I mean, again, it depends on your intention, but some might say the objective of a weapon is to kill someone, but then again, someone else might say no, the objective of a weapon is to prevent violence, right? Is to stop the other side, is to win through any means, but it doesn't necessarily mean having to kill anyone. And if that was the case, a weapon, you may say the best weapon is a gun, but equally the best weapon could be diplomacy, right? You could still win through negotiation without anyone dying, and it may be cheaper, and it may be better, and it may be more moral, right? So it's fundamentally interesting to look at what engineering really is in terms of problem solving, but at least from an information mutation perspective, it's interesting and important to understand the function and the purpose. And when you have those elements, those components that are comprising the end objective, reaching the end objective and the route to it, you then begin to get some idea of how data mutation can be detrimental and even terminal to a system. But yet it is quite a natural process. And it can lead to some advancement. It can lead to some benefit, just as all mutation possibly can. But as you mutate anything, if you mutate the gun, right? Take the rifle and just start changing parts of it and see how long it works for. Right? It's probably not going to work very long. Some parts you could change and get away with. Some parts you could change and may even help. But the vast majority of changes you could make, probably not going to improve its capabilities. It's probably going to decrease it in some way. And in the same way, the more that we can tolerate and compensate, and we have tolerance for informational mutation, data mutation, usually the more we'll see things stop functioning. Alright, short one now, but I appreciate you sticking with me, and I'd love to hear your views on this. This by no means is one of the ones where I've got a cut and dry view, and I think, it's just the way it's set out, and if you want to discuss it, I'll maintain my position. This is definitely one where I'm much more open to debate on it, and I would love to hear what you guys think, and if there's any stuff to be added in. So, yeah, have a good one, guys.